Is the Iran war flaring up again? The U.S. has fired at an Iranian freighter and stopped it. In response, Iran has declared that it attacked U.S. warships. This is accompanied by reports of Israeli fighter jets heading toward Iran, all while the U.S. maintains its blockade. We want to talk about this, as well as everything else there is to say and know in this situation report on the Iran war. Holy smokes! Now save the most at Holy with my code. Let's start first with the fighting involving the proxies. The fighting in Lebanon continues at a low level. Israel occasionally carries out airstrikes and occasionally fires artillery, citing immediate threats. There are also occasional firefights with Hezbollah fighters on the ground, as well as explosive attacks on Israeli troops. Overall, however, the level and intensity of the fighting has decreased significantly. The Israelis are currently occupying 55 villages in southern Lebanon. That's the current situation, and there is neither further advance nor withdrawal. The Israelis filmed themselves, or rather, an Israeli soldier was filmed destroying a figure of Christ in Lebanon. The Israeli military now assumes that the footage is authentic and has launched an investigation, as this would be a punishable offense committed by the soldier. The commander of the Quds forces, that is, the branch of the Revolutionary Guards responsible for foreign operations, is meanwhile negotiating in Iraq about the disarmament of Shiite militias. The Iraqi government, of course, does not want to have any uncontrollable military units that receive orders from abroad. It doesn't matter at all whether the government is Shiite or not. The U.S. is also putting great pressure on the Iraqi government. The PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, this alliance of Shiite militias that was formed during the fight against the Islamic State, are to be disarmed because the majority of these PMF do not follow orders from Baghdad, but from Tehran. There is also new information regarding the naval war. Effectively, Iran currently controls the Strait of Hormuz, which is de facto recognized by numerous countries, either by conducting direct negotiations with Iran or by allowing talks from their side. Iran also continues to select which ships are allowed to pass through the strait. The reason for controlling the strait is the fear of mines among civilian shipping. It's possible that Iran has laid some mines in the actual shipping lane. If you want to avoid these mines, you have to use the Iranian route, which Iran claims is safe, and that route goes through Iranian territorial waters, allowing Iran to easily control the ships. However, the U.S. is now starting to address this in order to solve the problem. Here we have the report, and according to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. mine-clearing drones are already on their way to prevent this and to clear the mines. According to U.S. experts, a cleared corridor could be established within a few days. For this, the drones have to search the area on the seabed, and then the identified mines have to be detonated. The cleared corridor doesn't have to be incredibly wide. It's enough if it's big enough to pass through. Because whether there are still mines to the left and right doesn't matter in this case, as long as this cleared corridor is clearly identifiable and clearly recognized. That means, from the American side, only a few mines would need to be cleared, especially since the expectation is that the Iranians probably laid fewer than 10 mines in total. Afterwards, of course, once this mine corridor has been established, it can naturally be gradually expanded by searching for more mines to the left and right of the corridor, thereby increasingly clearing the area. Meanwhile, a merchant ship was attacked, or rather stopped. In the radio transmissions here, you can hear in the background how they order the ship to stop, and then subsequently order them to leave the engine room, because they say they will fire on it. We can see it here now in the footage, how the American destroyer, the USS Bruins, is moving right next to the ship. And here we could see the fire, where the onboard gun is firing at the ship itself to destroy its engine room, and thus to ensure that the engine, the propulsion of the Tuska, that's this container ship we're seeing here, is stopped. In this case, The ship itself is sanctioned by the Americans. That means the Americans have even more reasons to take action against the ship. However, it has also led to direct consequences. So we have Tasnim, which is a news outlet attributed to the Revolutionary Guards, if you will. It stated, as a result, they attacked American warships with drones. After that, reports emerged that a large number of Israeli fighter jets were observed over Syria, flying eastward, that is, toward Iran. However, there are no reports indicating that there were renewed attacks on Iran. That means whether these were false reports or not is unclear at this point. What these fighter jets might have been doing there is at least theoretically conceivable. Also, that the Israelis might have wanted to use this as an opportunity to resume hostilities, but were possibly stopped by Trump. Meanwhile, the US itself states that 27 ships have already been stopped. As I said, only that one was fired upon and boarded. The other ships were forced either to return to port if they were within the Strait of Hormuz, within the Persian Gulf, and the Gulf of Oman, and if they came from outside, they were forced to turn around and head to other ports. So entry into the Gulf of Oman was also stopped from the east. The ship itself, the Tusker, which the Americans stopped by firing on it, is sanctioned by the Americans. It is, and this is interesting, it is also Iranian-owned and sails under the Iranian flag. According to the US, this means that this ship can also be taken as a prize by the US, so they can seize and keep the ship themselves. The law of war allows this in this context. The blockade itself is not necessary for this at all. A ship under the Iranian flag and owned by Iran is a legitimate prize of war, so it may be captured. However, this is not just about ships. It also applies to flavor. And if you've always wanted to control the strength of flavor with every sip, then today's sponsor has something truly sensational to offer. And it's a product that I'm personally really excited about. Companies like to advertise with innovations, and most of the time it's just marketing, blah. This time, I feel like it's actually different, namely with the holy syrup bottle. Syrup doesn't sound exciting, but there's really something special here. You can unscrew it, and then you see inside that there's a bottle that's full of syrup. The whole thing mixes right before you drink it, which means no shaking. And what's really exciting for me is that you can set the intensity between 1 and 5. All of this might not sound so spectacular yet, until you think about it a bit more. Now, since you don't have to shake it, you can use sparkling water, which gives it a whole new taste. I can tell you myself, at first I wasn't blown away, but then I tried it, and it was really tasty. And then I took it with me on the plane. It went through security. No guarantee that it will always be like that. I got it through, and then just had the flight attendants fill it up with sparkling mineral water on the plane. I had my own stuff with me, and I think I drank 4 or 5 of those bottles. It was incredibly delicious with sparkling water. Just sensational. Currently, it's only offered with iced teas. No hydration version yet. I don't even want to know how much I'll drink with a hydration version. The main thing is the intensity from 1 to 5. I only used level 1. That way, you get some flavor in your water. Especially with sparkling water, it's really pleasant. But if you want the full blast, you can set it to 5. Of course, it won't last as long then. But especially for those of you who found holy to be too strong, this is a really perfect option. A syrup bottle like this lasts for just over 5 liters on level 1. That's what they say, and that's also about my experience. With my code TorstenHeinrich, you of course get 10% off again. Then it only costs 49.50 euros for such a bottle plus 10 syrup bottles. That way, you can try out the whole range. You can give it a try. You'll probably see me less and less with the regular holy powder, because it's really this mix here that makes it special. Since it just came out, availability is of course limited, so it's better not to wait, but to grab it right away. So you don't have to wait too long for production to catch up with demand. So use code TorstenHeinrich to save 10%, making it $49.50. Of course, you're also supporting the channel by doing so. I'm really impressed with this bottle. Meanwhile, there is more information about how the war has unfolded so far. The Israelis have released some very interesting information, namely that Israel may have, or possibly did, carry out a commando raid inside Iran itself. So Israeli special forces were most likely on Iranian territory. And what's special about this is that they apparently disembarked from one of the submarines and operated from there. So the Israelis announced that their submarines have carried out the most far-reaching operations in their history, which, in the context of this war, can only mean that they were possibly either in the Persian Gulf or at least in the Gulf of Oman, and that special forces carried out operations there, which would be an indication that the Israeli armed forces landed ashore. There is currently no evidence for this, nor are there any real details about what they did, such as whether they blew something up or, for example, made contact with the Balak and helped them in some way. There is no information on this yet. Currently, there is only the Israeli information. Iran itself is using the opportunity of the current ceasefire to regenerate its forces. According to the New York Times, Iran still has about 40% of its attack drones and 60% of its launch vehicles. That means the launch vehicles for firing rockets, and that's really sensational. 70% of its rockets. That means the original rocket numbers break down like this. If we are to believe the government officials who commented on this to the New York Times, then 70% of the rockets are still available and 60% of the launch vehicles. Which means that if fighting resumes, Iran will still be able to keep firing for quite a while, and also inflict substantial damage, substantial salvos. Iran is also using the current ceasefire to make previously inaccessible material available again. The Israelis and Americans have often bombed tunnel entrances to trap the rockets and launch vehicles inside, if they couldn't be destroyed directly. And Iran is now, of course, taking the opportunity to use heavy equipment to clear out such buried tunnels, making their use possible again. According to the New York Times, 100 launch vehicles have already been dug out. These are really significant numbers, which imply that if the fighting continues, Iran will then be able to carry out substantial attacks again. Iran is actually not the only side currently preparing. There are also further reports about American transport planes that are on their way to the Middle East and returning from there, so transport flights are still taking place. It is conceivable that these are mainly anti-aircraft munitions, in order to be able to intercept missiles if fighting resumes. But at least in part, they are likely also special forces and equipment to carry out further attacks. And 2 new A-10s have also been observed, which have been deployed to the Middle East. The Americans lost an A-10 while searching for the downed pilots, and this one was obviously replaced. As for the regime itself, opposition media say that the Revolutionary Guards have now expanded their influence to the point that they were able to impose a security advisor on the elected president. That means the president probably wasn't allowed to choose his own security advisor. Opposition media also report that the situation has now weakened the president's position to such an extent that he can no longer fill any of the government or military positions, which would normally be determined by him. Because the Revolutionary Guards declare that in an exceptional situation, the military has to decide, not the president. That means, effectively, it's what we've already talked about several times. The Revolutionary Guards have control of the country, at least for the moment. It is also reported that Ahmad Vahidi, the commander of the Revolutionary Guards, is also said to control the negotiations with the United States. Negotiating would actually be the job of the politicians. So this points to an effective coup by the Revolutionary Guards. As I said, we've talked about this here many times before, and Iran experts had also mentioned this as the likely outcome of decapitation strikes before the war began. The foreign minister himself, according to Iran International, which is an opposition outlet that is very well connected, but of course has its own agenda aimed at weakening the regime. They say the foreign minister had shown flexibility in the negotiations, especially regarding the proxies. For example, support for Hezbollah, and that is said to have led to the Revolutionary Guards being outraged, and accordingly, the Revolutionary Guard is said to have ordered the foreign minister to return to Tehran. What? He followed this order, this command. As far as diplomacy is concerned, Iran continues to demand recognition of its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. And Iran says that ships that pay have priority when passing through the Strait of Hormuz. So Iran is saying that the capacity is limited, but with a payment, you can secure a window to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. In effect, of course, it's just window dressing though, which could, for example, allow Trump to say that Iran no longer prohibits passage without payment. Because if priority is only given with payment, it theoretically means that the rest could still get through with a bit of patience. The negotiations are set to continue tomorrow, but the ceasefire will end on Wednesday unless it is extended. And the Revolutionary Guards. Here, we have more reports from the Revolutionary Guards, where one channel says that the negotiations are effectively useless as long as the US maintains its demands and the blockade. So there is little hope that the negotiations will lead to anything, especially considering that the ceasefire ends on Wednesday. There were also reports that Iran might not even come to the negotiations at all, precisely for this reason, because they are pointless. However, now there is a new report that the negotiations will probably take place on Wednesday, which is the day the ceasefire would otherwise end. The blockade should clearly help with this, since currently, Iranian ships are not allowed to leave their ports, or rather, they are sent back to the ports or forced to turn away, which means that Iranian maritime trade no longer works. Iran doesn't just conduct almost all of its oil trade by sea. In total, 90% of its foreign trade is handled by ship. Of course, that's due to Iran's geography, which makes trade by any means other than ship very difficult. And according to the New York Times, that amounts to $340 million per day that Iran loses as a result. Trump himself writes about 500 million on True Social. Either way, Iran is losing hundreds of millions daily, and any possible small payments for the transfer through the Strait of Hormuz won't make up for it. So Iran is being weakened by the blockade. If we want to draw a conclusion, if the Revolutionary Guards can recall the people who are negotiating, then the US is negotiating with people who can't make decisions. So the most pressing question right now remains: will the war resume in a few days? It currently seems very unlikely that a finalized agreement will be presented on Wednesday. But an extension of the ceasefire is certainly conceivable, because both sides actually want to end the war, but of course on their own terms. If the blockade is maintained by the Americans, it will increasingly make Iran willing to negotiate. That's because of the economic pressure. It may be possible for the Revolutionary Guards themselves not to capitulate even under the blockade, but the economic damage that Iran is causing. The US negotiating position improves until a deal is reached, as long as no Iranian ship enters its ports during this time.
Aus den Häfen herauskommt.
At the same time, however, Iran is likely working to ensure that its offensive capabilities with drones and missiles are reconstituted, which will make it more confident. That means, from the Iranian side, they know, if the fighting starts again, they will be able to hurt the other states significantly once more. Among other reasons, because material that was buried has now been recovered. And of course, Iran also had the opportunity to take rockets from storage and bring them to launch sites. It has now had almost 2 weeks to drive around within the country and transport military equipment. And he certainly made use of that time. At this point, everything is still open. We will have to see how the negotiations go, if they actually take place on Wednesday, which currently seems very likely. But overall, the situation remains uncertain, and a renewed outbreak of war is absolutely possible. If you don't want to miss what happens next, then of course I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you don't miss future videos. If you liked this, please give the video a thumbs up. That helps with the algorithm, and leave a comment if you have something to add. That's all for now. Thank you very much for your attention, and see you soon. On Patreon as well as here on YouTube, I would especially like to thank Lieutenant Colonel Mahamori and the lieutenants Bertainment, Robert Viel, Lichtschättere, Anti-X, Meersmann, Malermeister Nagel, Markus P., Alex Rosenthal, Mad Best, Vision Soundlab, Zig Rider, Silvio Ströver, Möter 1000 Janisgu, Sascha Müller, Cunningham, Eustres, Shadow, Jans vom Eck, Uwe die Främ, Nickname 2Bib, Carsten Schulz, Tequila 42. Thank you very much. Without you, this wouldn't be possible.